the comic strip peanuts, and then you'd get these tiny little paperbacks, the dime store paperbacks. And I was obsessed with Charlie Brown and Snoopy, and that's where I learned to draw, really. So for like the first 10 years of my life, every character I drew looked like Charlie Brown, just bald like me now, and a round head. And it was somewhere around second grade where a teacher pointed out to me, like, oh, you should probably draw hair on characters so you could differentiate one from another. And that's when I learned to draw hair. But before that, everyone looked like Charlie Brown. I don't know if I ever thought of it in that sort of... I knew I wanted to work in comics. I knew I wanted to be a cartoonist. And there was a time when I fell out of love with the medium of comics. When I was in high school, I really distanced myself from comic books and role-playing games and all these nerdy obsessions of my youth. But I realized I loved cartooning. I wanted to pursue a career in animation at that time, and then became kind of disillusioned with that medium, because I realized to have a career in animation, I mean, there are people that just do things on their own, but it's very difficult. It's even more tedious than making comics. Usually you're part of an industry which requires hundreds of people. In best case scenario, you're a keyframe animator, but I wanted to do it all. I wanted to design the characters and write the stories and do the acting and create the backgrounds. And then that's when I kind of rediscovered comics and realized, like, oh, one person can do it all. This is a really great mode for self-expression. Basically, I had to go through this shift where as a kid it was all about escapism for me, the fantasy world of comic books. And then as I rediscovered as an adult, it became something about communication. My first book was, I think, Blankets, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, I did a book earlier that was about 120 pages. I wouldn't call it a graphic novel, It was a novella, maybe, which sounds even more pretentious. But basically, like, it was a short story in the format of comics. And Blankets was the first one that it was, I don't know, a little bit more novelistic in scope.
So for people who have not read it, could you please describe Blankets?
It's a coming-of-age story about growing up in rural Wisconsin, a snowy landscape. I think a lot of Canadians would relate to the landscape. It's about my relationship with my little brother growing up. We shared a bed together. And then a sort of coming-of-age romance that I think a lot of people can relate to, too. And growing up and falling from the Christian faith. I resisted the autobio element for a long time. So my first draft of the book, I was trying to change everything so it didn't resemble my reality. It was based off of it, but I was changing everything. And as I got deeper and deeper into the writing process, I realized it just made more sense to stick to the actual events, my actual experience, and to make it more real and autobiographical. But it was definitely influenced by some Canadian cartoonists, like Chester Brown did a book called I Never Liked You. That was probably the biggest influence on the book, which was about his adolescence, growing up in actually grew up more in a suburban atmosphere, but the sort of like melancholy, and I don't know, it was a very intimate book, and that's the kind of thing I wanted to create too. It was very surprising. It was an instantaneous hit. And when I was working on the book, I didn't think anybody would see it. I mean, that was part of, that worked for me, I think. I was very naive, and I was also like, oh, no one's going to see this book, so I can just tell whatever I want to tell. Now I'm more guarded, I think, as an author, now that I'm aware of audience. But then I was like, well, maybe a couple hundred people will see this, and I don't know if they'll be able to relate to it because I had such a specifically sheltered upbringing in this sheltered community in rural Wisconsin. But in fact, then I found that, all these universal themes of family and first love and faith kind of cross over a lot of boundaries. Probably the weirdest thing that's happened to me at a book signing event is that a couple proposed to each other in front of me. And he had carved out a copy of my book with the ring embedded in that, and then got down on his knee in front of his, girlfriend at that time at a book signing event.
And you were in front of you?
Yeah, so I was the witness.
Wow. So is it the average? I mean, is it
Yeah,
the
that
average?
happens all the time though at my signings.
Okay.
No, I'm teasing. No, that's the most amazing event probably that's happened. I spent a year just writing the book before I started drawing it. So there was 2 years spent drawing it, 1 year spent writing it. But I wasn't paid anything to make the book, so I was earning a living. I was working full-time as an illustrator, which was a pretty cushy gig, actually. It was a great, flexible way to make a living. So I was able to figure out a way to balance. Half of my time was doing paying illustration gigs, and then the other half was doing my personal work. So comics were purely my mode of self-expression. There's no money involved. I think what surprised me is that blankets, when I was working on it, was like my refuge from all the chaos of the rest of my life. Because I think my life was terrible then. On many levels. Like I was very poor, I was taking care of people, I was living in a really terrible apartment in Portland, Oregon that was complete chaos. It was just full of the most terrible scenes every day, drug dealers and abuse. So I do think of that time in my life as utter chaos, and the book itself was my refuge. So I could go into that space and feel a certain shelter or comfort, which are themes of the book too. I'm always writing visually. There's several actually layers to the way I write. So at first it's just doodles in a sketchbook, and I see what emerges out of that. They're sort of like hazy dream images. And then I start maybe creating an outline. I'll shuffle around note cards and start putting together a narrative around sort of the images I've accumulated in the sketchbooks. And then my first draft is drawn straight in the sketchbooks, and it's like a quickly drawn, like 10 pages a day, loose version of the book. And then I edit that, and I will draw hundreds of pages and discard hundreds of pages. I never knew the ending of the book, so I worked on that for a year and never reached that point of feeling confident in the ending, but knew I just had to start drawing. So I just started from page 1, chapter 1. And as I got closer to the ending, still feeling unhappy with the last chapter I'd written, I realized I actually had to live the last 2 chapters of the book before I could write them. So those were happening in real time while writing the book. There were some trips that I went back home to Wisconsin as an adult that I wrote into the book, and those summed up the finale of the story. I don't know if I have regret, but I couldn't tell a story, for instance, that depicted my family that intimately now, because I feel more protective of them in older age now. I was 23 when I wrote that book. So, and all those experiences of my childhood were still so close then too. So in a way they were still pure, that I don't know if I could access memory in that same way now. Right. The book is dedicated to my family, so I was thinking of my family while working on the book, and it was meant to be quite reverent to them. And it was my only mode of expression to communicate things with them. We didn't grow up in a really communicative family, a very Midwestern, stoic Midwestern family where you don't have any intellectual or emotional discussions. You talk about the weather at best. And so this was my vehicle to come out to my parents about all kinds of different things.